Okay, everybody, settle down. Thank you. Marius just gave me the signal to start, so we will. So, welcome to the afternoon edition of the Nativist Club. Hope everybody is in the right mood. I told Alfonso that I'm not sure anybody would disagree with his definition of nativism, but if any of you do, see Alfonso after class and he'll straighten you out. So this morning, Alfonso kind of laid out the rules of this meeting and what makes it different. There's one rule he left out, and not only did he leave it out, but he broke the rule, and that is introductions of speakers. So in the past, we have not given lengthy introductions at all, and two reasons. One, people know all these people already, and secondly, we didn't want to take any time away from them. Yeah, but that's not, Ingrid's not going to be penalized for this. It was understandable why Alfonso did that, because he had such a long history with Mike McCloskey, so that was forgivable. And I told them before Mike spoke that one of my all-time favorite papers, a science paper, was a study that Mike and Alfonso did on folk physics, which was published like in 1981. And I point that out just so you have a sense how really, truly old these guys are. So, you're very welcome. Okay, so our first speaker is Ingrid Johnsrude. I can tell you that she's from Western Ontario, and I'm not going to tell you anything else, except that we're thrilled that she accepted our invitation.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. I'm thrilled to be here. Perfect. Okay. So in the spirit of spring, I thought I'd present some relatively new work here today, some nice chewy data that maybe we can talk about afterwards. This was the title that I submitted to Marius, but in preparing this talk, I realized that preparing a talk is a lot like packing for a trip. You take out everything you think you're going to need, and then you put half of it back. And there just wasn't space for the brain, so there won't be any brain in this. It's going to be all good old-fashioned psychophysics. Yay! Okay. So when I was invited to come and speak here, I was thrilled, of course, but I was also a little bemused because of course, we all study concepts, but I don't study them in the, semantic representations in the brain kind of way. I firmly believe that perception and action are deeply and intimately intertwined, but I don't really study action. So that left me with objects. And I thought, yes, I do study objects. I study auditory objects. Specifically, in the work that I'm going to be presenting, I'm going to be talking about voices. And voices are a really interesting kind of object because they're actually two objects in one. When I speak, you understand the content of my speech, and if I say nativism, and if Alfonso says nativism, in some way that's the same thing, right? And so there's some normalization that has to happen for you to appreciate speech as language objects. But at the same time, voices are highly distinctive. Alfonso has a very different voice to me, and that's appreciating the voice as an object in a very different way. You may have a pre-existing representation of Alfonso's voice. You may have a pre-existing representation, maybe at least some of you will, of my voice, and those are quite distinct. So voices are interesting for that reason of being kind of two-faced. So when I say objects, I'm really talking about speech and voices. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about sound, the problem of sound. And I'm going to start with a quote from Wolfgang Metzger's book, Gesetze des Sehens. I apologize to the Germans in the room for my pronunciation. of that. So Metzger was a Gestalt psychologist, and he wrote a book about the laws of seeing. But in the introduction to that book, he starts, "The achievements of the ear are indeed fabulous. While I'm writing, my elder son rattles the fire rake in the stove, the infant babbles contentedly in his baby carriage, the church clock strikes the hour, a car stops in front of the house next door, one of the girls is practicing on the piano, at the front door her mother converses with a messenger, and I can also hear the fine scraping of the point of the pencil and my hand moving on the paper. In the vibrations of air striking my ear, all of these sounds are superimposed into a single, extremely complex stream of pressure waves. Without doubt, the achievements of the ear are greater than those of the eye." He then goes on to write a book about vision. But that is a really wonderful illustration of the problem. Chris Plack, a psychoacoustician in the UK, has his own take on this problem. This is his pictorial representation of that essential problem. Here he is with his girlfriend talking to him while they're listening to music, and there's car traffic outside. All of those waves are mixing together. And both Chris Plack and another psychoacoustician in the UK, Chris Darwin, have likened this problem to being at the shore of a lake and watching the waves lap on your feet. And by the pattern of interference of those waves, figuring out that there are 3 swimmers in the lake and what strokes those swimmers are doing. So that is computationally seems like a very difficult problem, but it's one that we don't seem to have much trouble with. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect is that the impression we have of sound, even when sounds are presented in a mixture, as they almost always are, our impression is of a single source, typically, right? We're pretty good at separating those sources perceptually so we can attend to the single source that we want to attend to. How do we do that? Well, there are a number of different mechanisms that have been proposed. A lot of these are based on Gestalt ideas. Al Bregman wrote a very long book in 1990 that illustrated a lot of the principles underlying auditory perceptual organization called auditory scene analysis in his world. And of course, there are primitive grouping mechanisms that are based on the acoustics of the sound. So characteristics like frequency, timbre, onset time, we group according to the similarity or dissimilarity of those things. Proximity in time matters. And I'll give you an example of that here. So this is a bit of foreshadowing. I'm going to come back to this task. This is a rather peculiar task developed by folk in the American military for studying multi-talker intelligibility under different circumstances. All of the sentences are of the form ready call sign, go to color number now, so ready Baron, go to green 7 now, for example. I'll play an example of that. Okay.
Ready Baron, go to green 7 now.
Right. So that's pretty, and all you have to do is on the matrix in front of you, you just press the color number coordinate to which Baron was told to go. Pretty easy if you only have a single talker. Gets a little more difficult if you have multiple talkers. If the talkers are of different sexes, it's not so bad.
Ready Baron, go to green 7 now.
Meh. If the talkers are different people but the same sex, it gets a little more difficult.
Ready Charlie, go to white 6 now.
As a hint, it's always green 7 that Baron's told to go to, in case you're wondering. And then if it's the same talker, right, games you can play if you're recording people, it's really hard.
Ready Charlie, go to green 7 now.
And that difficulty is reflected in accuracy rates, as you might expect, where when you have the same talker, as shown here, the ability to pick out that color number coordinate is rather poor. Whereas when the talkers are of different sexes, so their fundamental frequencies, their voice pitches are very different, then it's a lot easier, right? So this is just an example of how acoustics can facilitate perceptual separation of two voices. The other kind of heuristics, the other type of heuristics that can play into perceptual organization are knowledge-based heuristics, which Bregman called schema-based mechanisms. And I have a couple of examples of those. So this is where your knowledge informs the perceptual organization of what you're hearing. First, I'm going to give you an example from a colleague, Andy Dijkstra's work. And I want you to hear, there's an isochronous repeating tone sequence here, and I want to just see if you can hear it. Anybody hear a repeating tone sequence in there? Ah, very good. Okay, here's a clue. And here it is again. So once you know what you're listening for, it all seems so clear, right? So your knowledge is really informing your organization of that otherwise inchoate tone cloud. Here's another example. Listen to this. What was that? Some shaking heads. I'll play it again. Okay, for those of you who've experienced sine wave speech before, you may have recognized that as sine wave speech. Here's what you heard. Okay, I'm not going to say it, you're just going to read it. Now you're going to hear it again. Okay, so this time you may have got it complete with the British accent, right? Okay. So again, another example of how your knowledge really changes how you organize auditory stimuli. For a long time, I've been really interested in the kinds of knowledge that can help in speech perception. And in part, this is because I'm interested in older people. I'm becoming an older person. I have many older people that I care about, and it really bothers me that as people get older and peripheral hearing changes, it can be difficult to communicate. Social events aren't quite so rewarding. So how can knowledge and experience mitigate the effects of peripheral hearing loss? That's where I started with this. So in starting down that road, it's helpful to think about, well, what kinds of knowledge are there that could help? And I'll just go through some that have occurred to me. This is not by any means exhaustive. So if you think about a communicative situation, you have a talker who's intent on conveying a message. You have a listener who's intent on picking up that message. We haven't developed telepathy yet, so the message has to come out over the articulators, get passed through the environment, bounce around, maybe be masked by other competing sounds, and arrives at the listener's ear. Well, what does the listener know that can help them with this? Well, the listener knows something about what's in the talker's head, right? So the listener knows maybe the topic that's being discussed. The listener and the talker share knowledge of the world. They share a language, right, that has rules to it. The listener may know something about the talker, him or herself, may know that person personally, at least may know the sex and size of the talker, which can give you some information about their vocal apparatus, may be familiar with the accent that the person is speaking with. Some accents can be more difficult to understand than others, but if you have a lot of experience with that accent, of course, it becomes easier. And, of course, visible speech. If you can see the voice talking, as Olivier was briefly alluding to this morning, then, of course, that can make listening easier. At the environmental level, we seem to know something about the physics of sound. We have, it seems, this is work by Rich Freeman and others, we seem to have representations of the acoustic characteristics of different rooms so that we can predict the echoes that will happen in rooms of different sizes, to a first approximation anyway. And that allows us to clean up the signal a little bit. Something that I'm going to be talking about a fair bit is this idea of familiarity with the masking sound. So very often we're hearing sounds mixed with other sounds, and if the sound we're listening for is familiar, it I'm interested in a situation where maybe a sound that's also mixing, one of the interfering sounds is familiar. Does that help you hear the target better? And there are many ways that knowledge could help, right? So if there's a transient door slam or a cough or something, knowledge can help you fill in missing information. So I'm showing a waveform here, and the knowledge is helping you de-emphasize that occluding masking sound. It might increase the effective SNR, helping to either perceptually enhance the target or attenuate the masker. And it might improve perceptual segregation. And that's what I'm most interested in, what I've tried to focus on in my work. You can let me know whether I've been, well, I know I haven't been very successful, but you can let me know whether I stand a chance. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on voices, particularly familiar voices. And this is a list of the papers that I'm going to be talking about. And these are the people who helped with the work. And in the interests of diversity, there have been a lot of pictures of young women this morning. I thought I would acknowledge an older male colleague who also helped a lot. So the very first study I'm going to present was concocted with Bob Carlion over beers many years ago. Okay, so the question we wanted to ask, when we started, people had been looking at familiar voices, but they'd looked at familiar voices in a rather artificial way. People had been trained in the lab with voices that had previously been novel to them. And that's very different from when you really know somebody, right? Somebody you care about. So we thought we'd start with the ridiculous extreme of familiarity. We went for spouses. We've also done an experiment with mothers and their children, another very familiar voice, right? If you're a kid growing up, your mother's voice is, one you develop with. But we're looking at spouses here, long married spouses. So this is your spouse's voice is the first one you hear every morning, the last one you hear every night, every day of your life for years and years and years. Very familiar. We wanted to know, well, how much do listeners benefit when hearing naturally familiar voices, particularly the older listeners, right? Because older listeners spend a lot of time listening to people who they know. We also wanted to ask, how do they use that familiar voice information? Do they use it to match to a template, which according to Bregman is really the only way that you could use familiar voice information? Or are people doing something a little funkier, like using it to actually enhance the perceptual separation of voices? So Bregman, as I said, believed that familiar information only helps if it is the focus of attention. And he based that assertion on an experiment like this. So this is taken from the work of Dowling, an older paper, and I just love the simplicity of the title, a single author, and a really elegant study. And what Dowling did was he presented melodies interleaved with distractor tones. And the melodies were either familiar or unfamiliar, and the distractor tones were either familiar or unfamiliar. And he had the distractors and the melody either in the same range of pitches, or he moved them apart. And the question was, oops, going the wrong way here. The question was, how far apart do you have to move the melody and the distractors before people could recognize the melody and the distractor? Ooh, sorry. How far apart do you have to move them in semitones so people could hear the melody clearly? And was that difference smaller if the target was a familiar melody? And was the difference smaller if the masker was a familiar melody? So here's an example. You're going to hear a familiar melody, well, for many of you, maybe not for everyone, alternated with distracting tones in the same pitch range. And it's going to be presented several times. And every time, the pitch range of the melody, but not the distractors, will be transposed up to semitones. And I'd like you to raise your hand when you can recognize the melody, okay? Anybody? Okay. 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 I think most of you have it by then. So merrily we roll along, or Mary had a little lamb, but it takes a little while, right? And so what Dowling discovered was that if the target was familiar, if the melody, if the target melody was familiar, it took you fewer semitones to realize the melody than if the melody was unfamiliar. But there was no benefit of having an unfamiliar distractor melody, okay? And based on that, Bregman said, the familiarity of distractor sounds does not matter. It's only you only get benefit from familiar targets, period. Okay. I'd like to think that it's not so cut and dried, that in fact you maybe can get benefit from having a familiar masker present or a familiar interfering sound present. And I've been on that quixotic quest now for some time, and I'll let you know how I get on. That's what this talk is about. So we use the coordinate response measure procedure in our first study. This is for a couple of reasons. One is it's a very nice way of looking at talker intelligibility, and you can cue the target by the word baron, right? So you just tell your participant, listen for the baron voice, press the color number coordinate to which baron is told to go, and that means you can change the baron voice. Sometimes it can be familiar, sometimes it can be unfamiliar. Another advantage is that in previous studies with the lab familiarized voices, people had used what are called open set sentences, so natural everyday sentences like, it was a sunny day and the children were going to the park. The problem with that, though, is if you also have a familiar-unfamiliar condition distinction, people may be more biased in the familiar voice condition to guess at words, right? That familiarity might give them a sense of confidence, and they might be more inclined to guess words. And as the Canadian hockey player Wayne Gretzky said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. It's exactly the same thing here. You sometimes get a shot if, even if you've taken it wildly, sometimes it goes in the net. So sometimes if people are guessing, they're going to guess right. And so you could have an intelligibility difference in open set sentences, not due to a difference in sensitivity, but just because people are guessing more for familiar voices. So we wanted to avoid that. Here there's a single response in every trial. The groups we tested were older people and middle-aged people. We had approximately equal numbers in those two groups, and you can see that they'd been with their spouse for a very long time, 27 years, 35 years. So these are really familiar voices. And we tested everyone with 3 voices, the voice of their spouse, and then 2 unfamiliar voices who were other participants in the study, who weren't familiar to the listener, but who were sex matched to the spouse. So Bob Carline calls this a wife swapping study for that reason. So the target voice was familiar. The masker voice could be unfamiliar. That's this condition here. Or we could have unfamiliar target voices and a familiar masker voice. Or all of the voices could be unfamiliar. Where's my cursor? There. All the voices could be unfamiliar. So we had effectively 3 different conditions, and we ran this at multiple signal-to-noise ratios in a windowless soundproof booth. It was very exciting for the participants. And here are the results. Here you can see there's a very strong effect of signal-to-noise ratio, or target-to-masker ratio in this case, right? So this is the relative intensities of the target versus the masker phrases. When the target was familiar, we see a very robust benefit to that. And we also saw a marginal benefit when the masker was familiar. And these are large benefits. So on the order of 6 to 9 dB benefit for a familiar voice as when you're listening to it when it's the target, and about a 3 to 6 dB benefit when the masker is familiar and you're listening to a voice you don't know. So we would seem then to have, because we have this familiar masker benefit, we were going to conclude that, okay, what a familiar voice is allowing you to do is to perceptually segregate 2 voices that you're hearing at the same time so you can attend to one or the other. Okay, that was our tentative conclusion. We found some interesting age effects in this study. the first one we found was, well, this particular graph is not very interesting. So as age increases, accuracy declines. And at first blush, this looks like a peripheral hearing loss issue, right? Older people are more likely to have poor hearing, and we see that in the plot. Well, when we look at the familiar masker condition, we also see a slight negative correlation with age, but not quite as big, but not significantly different. But in the familiar target condition, we see no such decline with age. Okay? And so this is implying that this impairment we're seeing here is perhaps cognitive, because the acoustics of the situation were very carefully matched amongst all three of these conditions, right? Somebody's familiar voice was somebody else's novel voice. So the voices heard here as targets are exactly the same as the voices heard here as targets, just swapped around. Now you might think, well, maybe this is a ceiling effect or something. So we looked at conditions that were equated for performance at different target to masker ratios. So we took a target to masker ratio where the performance in the novel baseline condition was equated to performance in the familiar target condition. We did that here. And you can see the same pattern applies. So even when the listening conditions are relatively advantageous, as here, plus 3 dB, it's a pretty good target to masker ratio, we still see this decline with age. So this isn't an audibility thing. This is a cognitive thing, we think. Another interesting aging effect was that, if you remember, we had two groups. We had a middle-aged group, 44 to 60, and then we had an older group, 60 to 80-ish. And we saw a different pattern of performance in those two groups. So in the middle-aged group, we saw as much benefit nearly in the familiar masker condition as in the familiar target condition. There was no difference between those two conditions, and both of those were better than the novel baseline condition, of course. In this slightly older group, we saw a different pattern of results where performance in the familiar target condition, when you're listening to your spouse, it's all good, right? But then when your spouse is the masker, no benefit, just as though they were a stranger. So that was quite interesting. Not sure what to make of it, except that it may be an artifact of the materials, and I'll get to that in a moment. So this all hinges on this familiar masker benefit being a real thing, right, in the younger people. And I worry that it may have to do with the materials that we were using, with the particular task that we were using. So before I get to that, I'll just conclude what we tentatively concluded from this study, and then I'll go into picking the problems with this study and then how we address those problems. So we definitely see a robust benefit when the familiar voice is the target, which is good news for spouses going out for dinner everywhere. And we wondered whether this would be true for slightly less familiar voices. Foreshadowing, next experiment. And our middle-aged group, at least, benefited from having the spouse voice as the masker, suggesting that maybe having a familiar voice in the mixture is facilitating this stream segregation, but this may be an artifact of the materials, as I said. So what's the deal with the materials? Well, if you remember, all of the sentences are of the form ready, call sign, go to color number now. All the listener has to do is listen out for the Baron voice, and then press the color number coordinate that Baron was told to go to. And so all they're getting in a mixture of two voices is two call signs at the beginning, one of which is Baron, and then two color number coordinates at the end. As few as two things that they have to remember. So they could be doing this retrospectively. If they have a familiar voice in the mixture, right, they could be saying to themselves, oh, okay, well, was Joe's voice Baron, or was it the other one? And then they hold on to all the information they're getting, both color number pairs, and then at the end, retrospectively, they report their spouse or their not spouse, depending on whether Baron was their spouse or their not spouse. Okay, so effectively, the spouse is giving them this handy verbal label to hang on a voice, and then they can remember both color number coordinates and report retrospectively. And maybe that's why we are seeing a familiar masker benefit. we wanted to, because that's not how people listen to speech, right? We wanted something that would be more naturalistic, something more like the stream of speech, and you have to be tracking just the one stream, okay, and letting the other one go. Okay. Reasons to be cheerful, however. So, okay, maybe in artifact materials we'll go on, we'll test something that is a little more natural. But I do want to just point out one experiment that we've done, that we've performed subsequently, that gives me reason to hope slightly. This was a study conducted by Fabienne Sanson, and she used novel voices throughout, not familiar voices. She used the CRM procedure again, but what she was interested in is how does the consistency of a voice from trial to trial affect people's performance? One of the nice things about the CRM procedure is that you can mix up trials from different conditions. You can have a familiar target trial followed by a familiar masker trial. Remember, people are just listening for the barren voice, and so that voice can be anything, really, right? So you can mix up trials very efficiently. Well, Fabienne was interested in, well, what happens if you hold a voice consistent over trial? Do people benefit from that? And it turned out that people benefited not only when the target voice was held consistent, but also when the masker voice was held consistent. This doesn't look much bigger than this baseline condition where nothing's held consistent, but it was different. Don't worry about these two. This was another control condition that we ran. It's not relevant here. Also, people made fewer. There are two kinds of errors you can make in this task. A mixed voice error is where you report a color from one voice and the number from the other voice, right? Or the other way around. So you're mixing the streams, right? Don't cross the streams, but you're crossing the streams. That's a sign that there is no perceptual segregation. In contrast, a wrong voice error, both color and number are from the same stream, but it's the wrong stream. So you've separated, you've just gone for the wrong option. And what Fabienne showed was that the masker benefit was because people were making fewer wrong voice errors. There was no difference amongst the mixed voice errors, but there was a significant difference in the wrong voice errors compared to this baseline condition, as in the target, the consistent target condition. Okay, so this is some evidence that some kind of familiarity, a short-term familiarity in this case, may help you when that consistency is found in the masker sound. Okay. We replicated the familiar target study using a different corpus. This is the Boston University Gerald corpus, the bug corpus. And here, it's just like the CRM, except instead of reporting a color number coordinate, you have to report all the words, okay? So it's harder. Yeah, higher load on memory. You hear two phrases with two names, two verbs, two numbers, two colors or adjectives, two nouns, and you have to report either the Bob words or the Pat words. Okay. And here's the matrix that you use to report on. So you hear a pair like this.
Bob bought 8 new gloves.
And then you report. And in case you're wondering, if I want you to listen for the Bob voice here, this is going to be really hard because of all the reverberation in here. It's easier over headphones, I assure you. So Bob.
Bob bought 8 new gloves.
Anybody get Bob bought 8 new gloves? Well done. Okay, good. Okay, so this was a study done by my student Izzy Domingo, and we had two groups here. We had spouses, as before, but she also went for people who were in more casual relationships, so friends. And there's a lot of variability here, and there's a lot of overlap in the two groups, but in general, the spouses were older and had known each other for longer, and the friends were younger and had known each other for less time. Same conditions, and the results were somewhat different to what we had seen before. First, I'm showing you the older spouse group. I should say she divided the spouses into two groups, as we had done in the previous study, just because we had a very wide age range. You can see the range is from 28 to 82, so we wanted to divide that. So she used approximately the same age cutoff for the two groups as we'd used before to make two equally sized groups. And we see this strong effect of acoustics in this older group here, and not such a big effect of acoustics in this younger spouse group. And then in the friends, we see a rather similar pattern. There look to be differences here. There looks to be an interaction, but I assure you, we've looked at these data repeatedly, and there isn't an interaction. I think it looks like there is because Izzy's been a bit naughty, and she's started the graph, right? We're looking over a relatively compressed range here. So the only effects are that, well, there's a group by TMR interaction with the TMR affecting this group more than it's affecting these two groups. And there was a significant effect of condition with this familiar target condition being the best. People are getting a benefit from listening to the voice they know. Those are the only effects we see here. So, oh, and I should say that the friend benefit, although it looks smaller than this benefit here, it's not different, actually. So we see a robust benefit for a familiar voice target. Seems to be true when the voices are somewhat less familiar. And we don't see that familiar masker benefit anymore, which made me sad. But we have removed a lot of familiar voice information here. I'm just going to take a minute to explain that point. So what we have done here is we have done violence to interpersonal relationships, right? There's no visual information here. There's no spatial separation of two voices. It's a very stereotyped thing that you're hearing your loved one or friend say. And we've messed with speaking rates and patterns as well, because in order for the words to overlap, we had people, when they were being recorded, speak to a little line on the screen. Okay, so they're very artificially being timed in when they produce the words of these sentences. So we've messed with speech in almost every conceivable way, except we've let them use their own voices. And we're still seeing this robust benefit when that voice is the target. If we allowed talkers to be a little bit more natural, I wonder if we wouldn't see this familiar masker benefit reemerge. Anyway, I'm hopeful. Okay, I've got about 10 minutes left according to my timer here. So I'm going to tell you about two more experiments that we've done, exploring this familiar voice benefit a little bit more. I think it's quite natural to ask, once you've determined that a familiar voice helps, it's natural to ask, well, what is it about the familiar voice that's helping? So a postdoc in my lab, Emma Holmes, asked that question. And she contrasted two kinds of helping, right? That if there are two kinds of benefit you can get from a familiar voice. So to this point, I've been talking about the benefit you get from a familiar voice when you're listening in environments where there's a competing talker present. But of course, you know, we also use familiar voices to tell us who we're talking to, right? So we can ask, do the same acoustic characteristics that benefit identity recognition benefit intelligibility? And there's been some research on the characteristics that people use, what helps you in a voice to recognize somebody that you know, and both fundamental frequency and vocal tract characteristics have been found to be important for that. But we don't know about intelligibility. So just a brief primer on the vocal tract for those of you who may have known this at one point but have forgotten. The source filter model of speech production characterizes the vocal source as a complex harmonic tone generated by the vocal fold. So there's a fundamental, And then there are harmonic components, right, at integer multiples of that fundamental. And the amplitudes of those components fall off as a function of frequency. So this is the glottal source here. This is how you would portray it acoustically. As that source passes through the articulatory apparatus, the conformation of that articulatory apparatus filters the sound, enhancing some components over others. So here are those resonances. This is the filter that a particular shape of the vocal tract will give you, right? So this includes the tongue and the lips and the mouth, as well as this bit here. And what results is a filtered source with these things called formants, right? And it's the formants that tell you a lot about the linguistic characteristics, or the linguistic, they carry the linguistic information in at least vowels. So as the vocal tract gets longer, these resonances change. They spread out, and so the spacing between the formants increases. So we can simulate changing the vocal tract length by changing the formant spacing. That's one thing we changed. And the other thing we changed was the fundamental frequency, right? So we made that, we shifted it up, which then increases the spacing between the components as well. Okay, so either we're shifting the fundamental frequency, which changes the pitch, makes it higher, or we're changing the vocal tract length, increasing that, okay, making it longer. And as I said, both of these things have been shown to affect identity recognition. What Emma did was she had two tests that she ran on everybody in counterbalance fashion. Either she'd play a sentence at a time. So again, she used this bug corpus, Bob bought 5 green shoes. And she'd either play a single stimulus at a time and have people just say, is that your familiar partner or not? And she also ran the intelligibility test with 2 talkers, just as before. Okay, so we have familiar target conditions as before, and both unfamiliar conditions as before. But she's manipulating the vocal tract length and the F0. Okay, so either manipulation is imposed, and a 2x2 factorial, both manipulations are imposed. Couple of signal to noise ratios, because we like to manipulate that, or target to masker ratios. And what she did was psychophysically, she worked out for the listeners what the just noticeable difference was for their partner for the fundamental frequency and the vocal tract length, the formant spacing. And she worked out the 90% just noticeable difference threshold for those things. And then she imposed 1 JND of manipulation and found nothing. So then she thought, okay, what's the most I can do without it sounding really bad? So she imposed a 5 JND manipulation on both of those characteristics, and this is what they sound like. So here's an original.
Pat lost 9 small shoes.
And here's the manipulated fundamental.
Pat lost 9 small shoes.
And the manipulated vocal tract.
Pat lost 9 small shoes.
And both of them together.
Pat lost 9 small shoes.
Okay, so they still, I mean, they sound a little bit odd, but they still sound reasonably natural. And what she found was that manipulating the vocal tract length, perhaps not surprisingly, obliterated recognition, right? If you change somebody's vocal tract length, they're not the same person, and we know that acoustically. So these are D primes, and when we manipulated VTL or we manipulated both, the D prime was not distinguishable from chance, which here was 0.3 because she had to transform her data. However, you can see unshifted performance is good, right? People can recognize their partner when their partner's voice sounds natural, and they also recognized it when it was pitch shifted, which also isn't very surprising because we modulate our pitch quite a lot when we're speaking, and people can still recognize you when you change your pitch. I apologize for this graph. This is messy, but what you want to do is you want to compare the solid line and the dotted line of the same color. Okay, so we have familiar target, both unfamiliar, familiar target, both unfamiliar for F not manipulated, VTL manipulated, both manipulated, and then the black is the unshifted. And you can see that in all 4 cases, there's a robust difference between the solid line, which is the familiar talker condition, or target condition, and the broken line, which is the baseline. And that's shown here. I've just subtracted the dotted line from the solid line in all 4 cases to give you a benefit score, right? So here's the benefit of the familiar target over both unfamiliar. And you can see that there's a benefit in all cases. It's slightly higher here in the unshifted case than all 3 of these other conditions, but these conditions didn't differ from each other. Emma went on to Z-transform all these data and ran an ANOVA to look for an interaction to show that the pattern here is different from the pattern here, and it is. And so what we conclude from that is that identity recognition is severely affected. I mean, it's obliterated by large VTL changes, 5 J and D sized VTL changes, but not when you shift the pitch. And intelligibility is mildly affected by both changes, but only mildly. And so it would appear that explicit identity recognition and the benefit to intelligibility you get from a familiar talker rely on maybe different acoustic information, right? Suggesting that these are different ways of using familiar information. So that we thought was quite interesting. Okay. I have 1 minute, 2 minutes? No, I only have 1. Okay. The last thing I'm going to talk about is, well, what happens if you use different kinds of maskers? To this point, the masker has always been another competing phrase. In English, same structure and everything. We thought we'd manipulate the masker to test the following set of hypotheses. So if the benefit's due to better perception of the familiar voice, if you're just better at hearing, you've got better ears for that familiar voice because it's familiar, then the masker shouldn't matter. You should get that benefit regardless of the masker. And that benefit could be due to template matching, or maybe you know, your filters are tuned to highly familiar voices. Who knows? Your sensitivity. If your sensitivity is better for a familiar voice, you should get the benefit regardless of the masker that's used. If, however, the benefit is due to there being less overlap in the cognitive processes that are engaged by the target voice as you're hearing it and that competing masker as you're hearing it, right? If somehow the familiar voice is relying on slightly different cognitive processes in some way, then you should only see the benefit if the masker is English, comprehensible, you know, similar in terms of its demands to the target, okay? So that's what we were testing, and Emma used a slightly different task to the bug corpus, very similar conceptually, except this test also has Spanish and Russian speakers in it, so we could test a foreign language masker. And so we had a factorial design with 3 different kinds of maskers. Well, I'll start with the target. The target was familiar voice again, so same friends and spouses we've been looking at. Unfamiliar voices, again, the familiar voices of other people in the experiment. And then the 3 types of maskers were just the same as we'd used before. English, so native language maskers, okay? It turns out that handily, the people who recorded Spanish and Russian versions of this were bilingual, so we have English versions of those. We also have the Spanish and Russian maskers, and we created signal correlated noise, which is simply taking a speech utterance, extracting the amplitude envelope, using that to modify speech spectrum noise. Sounds crunchy. So that was the 3rd kind of masker. And these are the people she tested. So again, the pairs were very similar to pairs we've tested before, so friends and spouses. And this is what she found. So this is, she ran this test adaptively. So she was looking for the speech reception threshold, right? So the signal to noise ratio that would allow people to get 50% of the trials right. Okay, so a low number means that you're really good at this, right? A number that's closer to 0 means that you really need a more advantageous signal-to-noise ratio to do the test properly. So what she found was for the native speech, first these values you can see are quite close to 0. They're relatively high, but there's a big difference between them, and that's that familiar target benefit again. When the masker was foreign, we see that actually you can do this test a lot better with a foreign masker. It's a lot easier. And there wasn't as much of a difference between the familiar and the unfamiliar talkers. And then when the masker was that crunchy noise, there was no difference here. So that suggested to us that, well, first of all, I mean, we observed that the type of masker matters. The benefit's not due to better perception of the familiar target voice, right? It's not due to better sensitivity for that target voice per se. It seems to be due to cognitive factors. We think that speech spoken by familiar and unfamiliar talkers may be perceived using, using cognitive systems that are somewhat disjoint. And this may be compatible with an episodic account of speech recognition, such that if you are familiar with somebody, you store their voice and maybe tokens of their speech episodically, and maybe that's how you're retrieving the meaning of these sentences or the words in these sentences when that talker is familiar. That would be one way that the cognitive process is engaged by familiar and unfamiliar speech could be distinct. So in conclusion, familiar voices are easier to understand. Yay. Good news for all of us. They may help when they're the competing speech. Jury's out. Hope so. Not sure. Got to do more tests. Voices of close friends seem to be as beneficial as voices of long-term spouses, and we're looking into how long it takes somebody to develop this intelligibility benefit. How long does it take before you have the maximum benefit? Acoustic correlates of vocal tract length are very important for interpersonal recognition, perhaps not surprisingly, since we don't change our vocal tract length very much and we do change our pitch. Even large manipulations, though, of pitch and formant spacing didn't eradicate the familiarity benefit to intelligibility, suggesting that, well, there's some other information in the voice, some other information in the acoustics that people are using to derive this intelligibility benefit. We don't know what those are. And the familiar benefit to intelligibility seems to be due to cognitive factors. And this is like the result I showed you for the very first study, right, where I showed that older people didn't show any kind of decrement when they were listening to their familiar partner. So this seems to facilitate cognition in some interesting way that we don't know very much about. And in case you're interested in what we're doing now, we're wondering about voice learning. What's the most efficient way to learn a voice? How long do you have to be exposed to somebody? Is it duration or is it experience that matters? Can we replicate our finding with more naturalistic materials? Because we don't go around saying, ready, Baron, go to green 7 now. And so it would be nice to be able to replicate this. I am worried about that bias problem that I mentioned earlier, where people will report maybe more or guess more voices if they're familiar, but I'm sure we can. There are ways to overcome that problem. We're starting to take this into imaging to see whether representations for familiar voices are different in some way to those for unfamiliar voices. And in general, I'm just really interested in the effect of unattended material, the familiarity of that unattended material on perceptual organization of attended material, right? So, well, perceptual organization generally, so that you can hear that attended material better. And this cognitive difference, what is it? You know, how are familiar voices processed differently from unfamiliar voices? So with that, I will finish with thanks to Izzy and Emma and Fabienne and Bob and you for listening to me. Thank you.
Nice talk, Ingrid. I'm just wondering, in the thing of filtering out distractors, if you might do well to look for people who regularly have to learn to filter out distractors. Say, for example, someone who lives next to some train tracks or some kinds of sounds like that, or someone whose voice you deliberately want to filter out. Maybe that's where you get into the mother's voice.
Yeah. No, it's... So do you think that would generalize, or are you suggesting looking at their ability to filter out things that we know they can filter out?
Yeah, things where a situation where someone may be much more likely to have a lot of practice suppressing something.
That's a great
like
idea. So
in our old building, you could have tested me with the backup sound of the Tim Hortons delivery truck, for example.
Right. Yes, or the howlers on the door.
Hi, really interesting talk. Not something I know a lot about, but let me try to ask you. I was just trying to think about what processes you have to go through in order to perform the task and where the difficulty is arising. So it could be that you have to separate, the difficulty could be in separating the two signals so that you fail to separate, or that you're having difficulty processing the selected signal because of the unattended signal in some way that's not due to separation. Or I guess what I was, or you could be getting both signals and you had to, determine which one was the target signal and which one was not. So one question that came to mind is, in your Barron thing, I wonder what you would find in your different conditions if you asked people to report both of the coordinates. So that the familiar masker, you might do better reporting the unattended coordinates, and you might still do better reporting the attended ones, and maybe that could give you some additional clues as to what's going on.
Yeah, that's not something we've done. I mean, that is what we surmise, think might be going on, but we haven't tested it. You're absolutely right. I would predict that people would be able to report both coordinates, because in terms of the information, it is all there. When you hear these two-talker mixtures, you can hear both of them. And with the coordinate response measure procedure, where it's just the color number coordinates, you can hear both and report them. I mean, if you listen, it's pretty straightforward, actually. Your other question about why interrogating patterns of performance in more detail, this is why we have looked at errors, the types of errors people make, and trying to infer from the patterns of errors what might be going on, right? And so it's quite interesting and perhaps not entirely consistent with a perceptual segregation explanation that mixed voice errors don't differ amongst our conditions, right? So people, those are the errors where people are taking some elements from the one stream and elements from the other stream and reporting, that's a sign that things aren't segregated. And if people were using familiar voices to segregate, then we should see fewer mixed voice errors in that familiar masker condition, and we don't. Yeah, we see fewer wrong voice errors. People are very good about not reporting their spouse voice, but we don't see fewer mixed voice errors. Yeah. Yes, and we haven't looked at that yet. Yeah, we've looked at random errors where people are reporting words that weren't in either sentence, or when people are reporting wrong voice errors. But we haven't looked for the signature that you would see if people were segregating, but then going for the wrong one versus mixing up. It's a good point. Yeah.
Hi, Ingrid. Very nice talk. I always enjoy these examples of the masked speech and vocoded speech. And there was one example that I had never seen before, and I was very impressed that you can actually prime people or give information, cognitive information, by a written sentence instead of a spoken sentence. And that seems to speak to me in terms of I'm on a thesis committee for a student in Georgetown at the moment who studies reading. Mm-hmm. So the big debate seems to be again whether the visual signals that we use when we read are reprocessed and transferred into the auditory domain before we actually understand this.
Okay.
And this example seems to speak very clearly in favor of that auditory recoding. And I don't know whether you have an opinion on that, whether one could actually use this. I mean, this is a big topic in dyslexia, for example. Is dyslexia a visual disorder, or is it an auditory disorder? And these kinds of examples, I think, speak to the fact that audition is much more involved in reading than we actually think.
Yeah, well, what we don't know is whether it's obligatory or not. Certainly, the red forms can make contact with auditory sound forms if it's helpful. I mean, what's interesting in a multilingual group like this is that, well, what I don't know is whether that example works equally well if you are not a British English speaker. It works okay for me, but I know those materials well. So, I mean, I guess empirically you could ask, does the word prime help you just as much if you are a native British English speaker, or if you are an American English speaker, or if English is your second language or your third language? Yeah, that we don't know. But to answer your question, I don't think this tells us anything about whether that auditory information is obligatory, right? Certainly those written representations contact auditory.
It may not be early auditory, but it is certainly, since it works in terms of auditory masking, in terms of auditory, like the other examples that you've shown, it does suggest that it's beyond the visual domain at the very least.
Sure, but it doesn't really tell you whether it's helping the reading, which I think is what your question was, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, the other question would be, for example, in language acquisition. People are puzzled by that same question. How do little kids who don't know language figure out what the words are? The word borders, that you don't have a space in your speech, as you pointed out. So where are the breaks between the words, and how do they figure that out? So one could argue the same way that they have a certain amount of words that they learn, separately, and then they stand out in terms of the masking target, as you called it, I think, and then sort of use that as a scaffold to, it's maybe not the debate that we should have right now, but I was very impressed by all this.
Thanks. Yeah.
So thank you, that was very good. When you said in the beginning that the familiar distractor makes you better, it was so unintuitive to me that I was sure I misheard you. Because I would have thought that a familiar distractor would make you worse because your attention would be shifted towards that, and it would be harder for you to focus on the target. So then my question is, what happens and what would you predict, I don't know if you've tested it, if you have both a familiar target and a familiar distractor?
Yes, we haven't tried that, but I can tell you that if there was any attentional bias, if people were really, drawn to that familiar voice when using the master, people should be making wrong voice errors, right? They should be recording either the number coordinate that the master was supposed to do, and they don't see the
No, and it seems, if anything, to be helping them. So I believe your data is just unintuitive. But then, so I wonder if there's any, so when there's only one familiar voice, then maybe you can use that information to ignore it. But what happens when there are two familiar voices, and will there be an interaction?
Yeah, we haven't looked at that. I will just point out, it's not significant, but we do see this very reliable, I'm sorry, I'm going back to, here. We do see this very consistent effect here, where the familiar masker performance is below the novel baseline performance, right? Suggesting that, maybe people are attentionally biased, but this is not significant. And yeah, that's a very good point.
I'm interested in, this is a good slide for this question, I think, the process by which you identify a familiar voice or a voice as familiar. How do you know? And I thought that the sort of speculation that you presented about it maybe being dependent on episodic memory is very intriguing, because it suggests that there are other cues aside from the sound itself that might be priming people in some way, and that could allow it to extend far beyond, you know, an individual partner or friends, right? So you could do an episodic memory experiment, you know, where you introduce faces that are paired with voices, and can you induce these sorts of effects, or does it require extensive experience?
You can train. It takes. We're working out now how easy it is, how easy it is to train voices. We had a very interesting negative effect where we had people listen to audiobooks, and we thought, oh well, that should familiarize people with voices, and then we'll test them on an intelligibility task using corpora like these, recorded by the same voices that recorded the audiobooks. No effect at all. So no benefit, even from 6 hours of listening to an audiobook. People were no better at hearing, at understanding that voice when it was producing sentences like this, which I find peculiar. People in the past have trained voices, but they've trained them with a little bit more information. So they've had people explicitly attend to the voice and then assign a name to it. So they've given it an identity. And I wonder if there's an interesting disconnect between just hearing a voice as a vehicle for content, in which case you don't pay any attention to the voice at all, or explicitly learning something about a voice. Sorry, that's not entirely.
No, that's exactly what I was, you know, in the social cognition literature, they often do these manipulations of providing personality details, vignettes about somebody's behavior to try to build up really rich identities, and I wonder if you could get better, faster learning of voices in that case.
Yes, we're wondering exactly the same thing.
Oh, sure. I have a question. It's just really an empirical question. So in that sentence reading priming thing that you showed, if you just give half the sentence, does that prime the whole? In other words, if they just hear the first couple of words,
I see. Yes.
Can they still disembed the entire thing?
Yes, we haven't done that, but we've done something similar, where instead of giving people the verbatim sentence, we give them words that are semantically related to words in the sentence.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, they were sort of like newspaper headlines. I can't recall any offhand, but the important thing is they were 3 words for each sentence, and the words did not appear in the sentence, or any of the morphological variants didn't appear in the sentence. They were just related in meaning to the sentence meaning, and that produces an enhanced intelligibility. Yeah, you get the same kind of effect. Well, similar. It's not as big, but yeah.
Thank you.
Just a question out of pure curiosity. The most familiar, but in some ways also least familiar voice we have experience with is our own. If you test that, what does it look like?
You get a target benefit. We did that with the mums. So we did.
I didn't hear you.
No. I didn't mention it. So I don't have the data for that precise condition here, but we tested a subset of. We recorded mothers, and we then tested the children and the mothers. So we tested the children listening to their mom's voice and other mums, and we found, as you might expect, they were better at hearing their own mom than other mums, and they weren't very good at ignoring their moms, so that's good. We also tested the mums with their own voice and the voices of other mums, and we found a benefit there that was, it looked similar in size. The study was a little underpowered, but it's such a robust effect that it was significant, but it didn't really allow us to compare it in magnitude to benefits we've seen in other studies. But there's definitely a benefit there for hearing your own voice. Now, of course, when you hear your voice recorded, it's not the same, right? Yeah, but we still see the benefit.
I was wondering about the familiarity definition here, or maybe the function of the familiarity, because you may think that maybe the thing that drives this significance for the familiarity voice is is the beneficiary of the voice for the person who hears it. And what I mean is that you might hear some voice not very often, but it is very significant for you. You can benefit for hearing this voice. Maybe it can warn you, maybe you get some emotional strength from it, and maybe that's what drives the whole modulation of the signal that you hear.
Right, so you're saying it's not so much the experience per se, it's the quality of the relationship, effectively. Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and I think it's kind of related to what Nick was saying earlier, right, that these voices have to be meaningful to you in some way to make you need that, whatever the significance is of that person to you, if that's going to, in some way, facilitate.
Let me just ask a quick question about the priming phenomena that everybody's talking about. So you know that certainly within vision, you can show people a stimulus and they have absolutely no idea what they're looking at. And you can give a cue, maybe a verbal cue, it's a dog, and then they instantly disambiguate the stimulus. And now, anytime they see it in the future, they instantly do it, and it seems to last forever. Is there, so going back to the Mary Had a Little Lamb phenomena, once people do that,
Can you hear
does that last? Will they disambiguate immediately the way you do in vision?
Yeah, no. I have to say that both, so this was the demonstration with the inchoate tone pips, and then the Mary Had a Little Lamb as well. I don't think they stand the test of time so well. But this thing, right? That lasts. I don't know, did it last? Yeah. It seems to last for a very long time. Yeah. I mean, I don't know that anybody's ever looked at how long it persists, but anecdotally I can tell you it seems to persist. Yeah. For this particular thing, right? So we have done studies where we've looked at how well learning on this generalizes to new sentences and new words, and that does seem to happen reasonably quickly. We don't know how long that lasts either. That's a different, it's probably a different kind of thing to learning a specific instance.
If I understood correctly, it seems that the same familiarity effect could work also with music and with voices, right? So I was wondering what is common between these two things. And in music, obviously, you have predictability, right? You know the tempo and these things, so you can predict what comes next. So I was wondering in the voice, if a similar phenomena could occur also, like the prosody of the voice, that you could actually predict the stream of sounds that will be produced by that person, because you know how this person temporally speaks, and then you can basically filter out that more clearly.
Yes. I have two things to say to that question. One is that we did mess with people's natural speaking ways and rates. So we gave them something to read, right, which was the sentence, ready, Baron, go to green 7 now, or Bob bought 5 green bags. And a lot of people, when they read in a very artificial way. It's not like natural fluent speech, and our people were just like that. They read in this very artificial way. And that stiltedness was further accentuated by the fact that we had this timer on the screen, and they had to say particular words in the phrase at particular times so that our phrases would overlap. Well, so we've really messed a lot with that. Now, there still may be some information there. I think when people produce words that they know well, that production could be somewhat ballistic, and so maybe there are some predictable features within a word if people can be fast enough to use those to anticipate where the word is going. I'm not sure that's necessary in this kind of closed set test where there's a fixed number of things that it could be, and green is different enough from blue that you don't need that kind of fine phonetic detail to make the discrimination. Yeah. The other thing that is we are embarking on a perhaps cockamamie study. So voices are timbrally distinct, right? What sets your voice apart from, well, my voice is pitch, but also timbre. And so we are interested in the timbre of musical instruments, and we're going to test musicians where the target melody is played in their instrument, the timbre of their instrument, or the maskers in the timbre of their instrument, and asking them to segregate another musical stream played in an instrument that's less familiar to them, and we'll see what happens.
So on that note, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi. Oh, thank you.
Posters and coffee now.